Well, thanks very much for tuning in to this presentation. My name is Bob Morrison. I'm a veterinarian at the University of Minnesota, and I spent several months in the last half year focusing on the carbon markets, and I'm going to be talking about the carbon markets and livestock and a little bit about climate change in this presentation. And for any of you who listen to this in advance of the Layman Conference, I will be presenting at the Layman Conference, and you can come and see me and we can talk about it in more detail should you want to. In the outline of this presentation, I'm going to be firstly talking about what greenhouse gases are in light of climate change. Secondly, we'll talk briefly about the role of agriculture and specifically livestock. Some comments on our footprint. National Pork Board's got a very substantial project working on the footprint. And secondly, I would like to make some comments about digester projects. Then very briefly what carbon credits are and where are we headed. So this is a very convincing picture to me. In 1941, you see the Muir Glacier in Alaska on the left, and then you see a picture from roughly 60 years later, the same glacier and basically in liquid form. These sorts of observations where you see something changing so dramatically can be very convincing. From a scientific point of view, they can be misleading. But these observations are one piece that go into the puzzle of trying to understand whether the climate is changing or not, and secondly, the role of humans. But regardless of whatever your view is with regards to climate change, regardless of that, I think there is some common ground that we can all believe in, and that is that as we think about energy, we would all say, well, our current energy sources are increasingly scarce and costly, and by current energy sources, I'm referring mainly to fossil fuels. So increasingly scarce and costly, and then we can say, well, wait a minute, manure, it can be a source of renewable energy, and it's actually available 24/7, as opposed to, let's say, wind or solar. So as far as manure being a source of renewable energy, it has some advantages over wind and solar. Secondly, we would say with regards to energy that the more efficient we are, the more money we can save. We can all, regardless of, again, your beliefs on climate change or not, we can all say, well, those two things are certainly true. Energy is increasingly scarce and costly. Efficiency can save us money. Second big point on this is that our consumers are starting to ask about our carbon footprint. You can go to a variety of websites and you can see where the carbon footprint of pork is suggested, and you can compare that to other food products, other menu items. And consumers are increasingly concerned about the environmental impact with regards to energy consumption from a pork point of view. And thirdly, we know that emissions lead to regulations which increase cost, and emissions mainly for livestock production revolve around methane, nitrous oxide, etc. And so those are three aspects that, regardless again of what you think about climate change, that we can all say these are of common interest. Let's talk about greenhouse gases first, just to give you some background on what people are talking about. Greenhouse gases are those gases that trap heat within our atmosphere. There are 6 or 7 different greenhouse gases that are commonly referred to, and what scientists have done is they've figured out what their potency is, relative potency of each one, and then they compare that to carbon dioxide. And so what we can do then is we can say that, for example, nitrous oxide is 296 more times more potent as far as capturing heat than is carbon dioxide. Methane is the gas that we're most concerned about in the livestock arena. It remains in the atmosphere for anywhere from 9 to 15 years and is at approximately 20 times more effective in trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2. And so therefore it is said to have a potency of approximately 20 times. Here are the other greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, you can set by default, you can see is by default 1. Methane, 21 to 23, depending on your time frame. Nitrous oxide, 296. And those are the main ones that we're concerned about with regards to agriculture. Let's talk briefly about agriculture's role with regards to greenhouse gases. There's been a couple of reports. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the main scientific body that it was put together through the United Nations and is working on climate change, they estimate that livestock globally account for approximately 10%. FAO did a similar study, and they suggest around 18% of the greenhouse gases, mainly methane, comes from livestock. And methane, the major livestock species then is ruminants. When you think about swine, we are drops in the ocean compared to ruminants when it comes to methane emissions. So here's a couple of quotes from this FAO study that livestock has a large impact on climate change. There is a rising demand for animal products, and we need to find environmentally sustainable solutions. All of this revolving around the role of livestock, more specifically ruminants, with regards to greenhouse gases, and with regards to greenhouse gases, more specifically methane production. Let's look at some reduction opportunities for agriculture. Clearly, as I said, agricultural methane is our major greenhouse gas, and we have ways by which in livestock in general now, and swine specifically, that we can reduce that emission. There are a variety of improvements that we're making in our crops that we can decrease nitrous oxide emissions as well. And remember that that's 296 more times more potent than carbon dioxide. So we can reduce our emissions. Secondly, within agriculture, we can capture CO2 in soils, and so we can do that through reduced tillage methods, or converting, let's say, crops to grasslands, should we want to do that. Or secondly, there probably will be some cropland, some residual land, some perhaps marginal land that is converted into forestry, and that will capture carbon dioxide. So agriculture, or land, let's say in general, has a second role, an important role with regards to sequestration of carbon dioxide. And thirdly, with regards to an opportunity for ag, is to avoid or reduce our fossil fuel emissions. And we can do that in two ways. One, we can be a source of renewable fuel. Should we capture our methane from our manure? And secondly, transportation biofuels. You know that agriculture, whatever you think of the politics of it, whether it's good or bad, we are becoming a source of biofuels through agriculture, from agriculture. And secondly, with regards to avoiding fossil fuel emissions, we can be more efficient with regards to our energy consumption and reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. So those are all ways by which we can influence the emissions of greenhouse gases, and specifically methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture. I want to talk very briefly about measuring and managing our footprint, because, as I said, there's increasing interest in this, and secondly, National Pork Board's got a very large project where they're focusing on this. Three things come to mind. One, efficiency. If there's a major argument that can be made in favor of efficiency, it's that we decrease our carbon footprint. So think about the different forces that we have in society today that are coming at us, for example, for crated gestation, for confined housing, for using growth promotants. All of those we do to increase efficiency. We want to produce as much pork as efficiently as we can. And in so doing, what we do is we reduce our carbon footprint, which is a great thing when it comes to the environment. I'll show you a chart here coming up next, but it's really interesting, the changes we've made in terms of our carbon footprint from efficiency. Secondly, as I said, we can decrease our power consumption. We can be more efficient with regards to our consumption of power. And thirdly, when the economics are more attractive, and they're not very attractive yet, we can capture our methane emissions and become a source of renewable fuel. Now, this chart here is really interesting. You'll see over in the bottom right, it was just published in the Journal of Animal Science, a highly credible journal. And you look at the two bars on the left, the carbon dioxide per cow in 1944 compared to 2007. And you see that the 2007 cow consumes approximately double the carbon dioxide than does the 1944 cow. However, you look at the right and you say, well, the product here is milk, and we are producing milk similar to us producing pork. And you see that the carbon dioxide per kilogram of milk in 1944 was over 3 times, approximately 3 times, what it was in 2007. So in other words, while we consume more carbon dioxide per cow today, we are so much more efficient. We're almost 3 times more efficient when it comes to our carbon footprint in milk than we were in 1944. And if you were to look at pork, a very similar argument will be made. That is, that the more efficient we are, everything we do about efficiency will decrease our carbon footprint. And the argument being, if we're going to eat meat, let's do it as efficiently as possible and minimize our carbon footprint. Some comments on digesters. You see here manure being captured from this dairy or hog facility in the lagoon, and in this particular lagoon it's covered, and what you have is the manure basically percolating or fermenting, producing carbon dioxide, methane. And then that methane, the biogas, goes off to the right there. You can see it going off to that facility, and that biogas is approximately 60% methane, the remainder being carbon dioxide and a little bit of carbon monoxide. But it goes into, in this little graphic, it goes into a generator, which generates electricity, and then you see CO2 coming off the top. And so basically the idea is you're taking methane, which has got, remember, 21 times the potency from a greenhouse gas point of view as does carbon dioxide, and so you're emitting carbon dioxide instead of methane, which is good. And then secondly, you can capture electricity, a renewable energy source, for the farm. And so this is great from several aspects in theory. Now, swine manure digesters, we did a study this past summer, as I said, in theory are a great idea. In practice, they're really under challenge, and we'll look at one as an example. Here are the costs that you would incur if you were to put up a swine manure digester. You've got the equipment and project costs, operating maintenance, and then if you have to use gas in order for a boiler or something, when the gas production from the digester is down, sometimes you need to use supplementary gas to keep it heated. So, and then revenues can be, if you are generating electricity, you might be selling that electricity, or you might offset the electricity that you would be using otherwise at home. You can capture revenue for carbon credits. There are tax credits. And then sometimes some folks will capture the heat from the generator, and you can offset heat use at the farm. We looked at, as an example, we looked at a digester that had roughly 2,800 sows, 8,000 nursery pigs, and 16,000 finishers feeding into the digester. This is called a fixed film digester, and interestingly, these folks have been trying extremely hard to get this to work, but they're currently 50% over budget, and the board managing the farm is extremely frustrated because they've put more than they anticipated into this project, and it's still not working like they would like it to work. This is just a picture of the digester, and the issues that they're faced with basically revolve around insufficient gas production. This is occurring especially in the wintertime when the manure entering the digester is a lower temperature. The design on this particular digester was for 3 days retention at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which for most other digesters we would say is low, and may be one of the reasons for insufficient gas production. And secondly, the second possible reason for the insufficient gas production is maybe as a manure source today going into the digester, we're so efficient on feed efficiency that there's relatively little raw material to generate methane in that digester. So the too low of volatile solids is a possibility on the product going into the digester. Secondly, we don't really know the influence of antibiotics and heavy metals from nursery diets. Thirdly, what about the fact that we flush or wash down farrowing facilities once a week with disinfectant. Could that be influencing the bugs that generate the methane in the digester? So this is just an example of one farm that's trying hard to get this digester to work and struggling. This is a list of USDA digesters, swine digesters, that we're aware of in the United States today. And we've reviewed several of these, and I think it's fair to say that the majority are struggling. And this is available online should you choose to look for them. But the majority of these are struggling, and I think if of those we've talked to, would not put up a digester again today, given the struggles they've had. And then there are several digesters that have been shut down or canceled, and again, I'm emphasizing these are swine digesters, and the issues being that I don't think we've got the swine digester technology figured out in light of today's economic conditions. A few comments on carbon credits. Carbon credits are a financial payment that somebody is going to make to you for your efforts in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. So in other words, let's say today I was to put up a digester. Before I was emitting some methane into the environment. Today I put in a digester, and now I'm emitting less methane than I was. That reduction in methane emission can be quantified, or at least estimated, and calculated to be an equivalent of CO2, tons of CO2. Those annual reduction of tons of CO2 are called carbon credits. Each ton is one carbon credit. And those carbon credits can be sold. Now, one caveat of carbon credits is they have to be additional and permanent. In other words, in the marketplace, I have to be able to demonstrate that those carbon credits have not always been there, that I haven't had, for example, that I did, in fact, have these methane emissions before, and now I don't. And I wouldn't have done it without, perhaps, the augmentation to income by carbon credits. In other words, it's truly an additional feature that I've put into my farm. And secondly, it's permanent. It's not transient, the change that today I'm emitting less emissions and tomorrow I will be emitting them again. It's a permanent addition to my farm. Those carbon credits trade in the United States in the voluntary market. We, in other words, are not, we're not compelled to reduce our emissions beyond what the EPA requires. And so those carbon credits trade you can trade them on the Chicago Climate Exchange, or you can trade them in private trades among individuals. It's a voluntary market. Here's where you see the price of carbon credits at the Chicago Climate Exchange over the last approximately 6 years. The green line is the price per ton, and you can see that most recently when I checked these prices, which was early September, they were at a record low, and that reflects that reflects basically supply and demand of carbon credits and people's estimation of what they're worth. And so that's a discouraging, if you're in the market of selling carbon credits, that's a discouraging price, of course. The data would suggest that given our increasing interest in greenhouse gases, and in our case, methane, that these carbon credit prices are going to go up. Here's some estimations from March of 2008. Now, I want to emphasize 2008 when energy prices were extremely high, and these are some estimates. This is a survey of 2,591 individuals, of which you see up in the top left, 2,157 were in Europe, and 967 in U.S. And here you're seeing what these folks are estimating the price of carbon credits will be in 2020. So I just told you that they're currently trading at less than $1, and these folks were estimating them. You can see the bulk of them are saying, we think they're going to be in the $30 to $50 range per credit. Now that's so 30 to 50 times what they are today. Now again, I want to emphasize that was a year ago when energy prices were at record high. Today, here's what carbon credits are estimated to be selling at here, and you can see the estimate for 2012 to 2015, an estimate by the EPA. and another estimate for 2020 by the EPA at $16. The Energy Information Administration is estimating them to be worth $20 to $32. And for this reason, because this is, again, 13 to 32 times what they're trading today, in the Senate, they're discussing, as they discuss a climate change bill, having a price floor and a ceiling on these carbon credits. And there you get a price for what they anticipate these carbon credits to be trading for, $10 to $28. As you think about the price of a carbon credit then, let's say $10 a credit, and let's look at the second bullet being a swine digester. If you were to put up a swine digester, you can see that you would generate 2 to 3 tons of CO2 per pig space per year from that digester. So if you had, let's say, 10,000 pigs, and you were generating 2.5 tons of carbon credit per year, that'd be 10,000 times 2.5 times $10 would be your carbon credit income from that digester. And then you see down below the current over-the-counter credits that are given for reduced tillage, 0.2 to 0.6 tons of CO2 per year should you sign up for reduced tillage agreements. And that 0.2 to 0.6 depends on the region of the country. So where are we headed? Clearly, I think we would all agree as energy becomes increasingly scarce, it's going to become more expensive. And so what that means for us is that the more efficient we are as consumers of energy, the lower will be our cost, and that's going to only increase in terms of pressure for us to become more efficient. And secondly, as energy becomes more expensive, we're going to have an increasing opportunity as being a generator of renewable energy. I said that these digesters don't look very attractive today for swine, but as energy costs go up, the return on investment will also go up, and we'll get these little technical issues figured out, I'm very confident. Secondly, there will be increasing pressure for us to reduce our footprint. That's going to come from our consumers, and we're going to be looking at production efficiency and intensity, and as I said, that's a great reason to continue to be as efficient as we can. We're going to be reducing the footprint not only of our pork, but in so doing, we're going to look at our inputs, and our biggest input is going to be corn, and we're going to say, how can we reduce the carbon footprint of our corn input, and thereby reduce the carbon footprint of our product, pork. So what we've done in this presentation is we've briefly discussed climate change and what greenhouse gases are and what their relative potencies are. We talked very briefly about the role of ag and then opportunities for agriculture as we look ahead. Briefly, we discussed carbon credits and what those are, and finally, where I think we're headed. Appreciate your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you at the Layman Conference should you come. Thank you. Well, thanks very much for tuning in to this presentation. My name is Bob Morrison. I'm a veterinarian at the University of Minnesota, and I spent several months in the last half year focusing on the carbon markets, and I'm going to be talking about the carbon markets and livestock and a little bit about climate change in this presentation. And for any of you who listen to this in advance of the Layman Conference, I will be presenting at the Layman Conference, and you can come and see me and we can talk about it in more detail should you want to. In the outline of this presentation, I'm going to be firstly talking about what greenhouse gases are in light of climate change. Secondly, we'll talk briefly about the role of agriculture and specifically livestock. Some comments on our footprint. National Pork Board's got a very substantial project working on the footprint. And secondly, I would like to make some comments about digester projects. Then very briefly what carbon credits are and where are we headed. So this is a very convincing picture to me. 1941, you see the Muir Glacier in Alaska on the left, and then you see a picture from roughly 60 years later, the same glacier and basically in liquid form. These sorts of observations where you see something changing so dramatically can be very convincing. From a scientific point of view, they can be misleading, but these observations are one piece that go into the puzzle of trying to understand whether the climate is changing or not, and secondly, the role of humans. But regardless of whatever
your view is with regards to climate change. Regardless of that, I think there is some common ground that we can all believe in, and that is that as we think about energy, we would all say, well, our current energy sources are increasingly scarce and costly, and by current energy sources, I'm referring mainly to fossil fuels. So increasingly scarce and costly, and then we can say, well, wait a minute, manure, it can be a source of renewable energy, and it's actually available 24/7, as opposed to, let's say, wind or solar. So as far as manure being a source of renewable energy, it has some advantages over wind and solar. Secondly, we would say with regards to energy that the more efficient we are, the more money we can save. We can all, regardless of, again, your beliefs on climate change or not, we can all say, well, those two things are certainly true. Energy is increasingly scarce and costly. Efficiency can save us money. Second big point on this is that our consumers are starting to ask about our carbon footprint. You can go to a variety of websites and you can see where the carbon footprint of pork is suggested, and you can compare that to other food products, other menu items. And consumers are increasingly concerned about the environmental impact with regards to energy consumption from a pork point of view. And thirdly, we know that emissions lead to regulations which increase cost. And emissions, mainly for livestock production, revolve around methane, nitrous oxide, etc. And so those are three aspects that, regardless, again, of what you think about climate change, that we can all say these are of common interest. Let's talk about greenhouse gases first, just to give you some background on what people are talking about. Greenhouse gases are those gases that trap heat within our atmosphere. There are 6 or 7 different greenhouse gases that are commonly referred to, and what scientists have done is they've figured out what their potency is, relative potency of each one, and then they compare that to carbon dioxide. And so what we can do then is we can say that, for example, nitrous oxide is 296 more times more potent as far as capturing heat than is carbon dioxide. Methane is the gas that we're most concerned about in the livestock arena. It remains in the atmosphere for anywhere from 9 to 15 years and is at approximately 20 times more effective in trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2. And so therefore it is said to have a potency of approximately 20 times. Here are the other greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, you can set by default, you can see is by default 1. Methane, 21 to 23, depending on your time frame. Nitrous oxide, 296. And those are the main ones that we're concerned about with regards to agriculture. Let's talk briefly about agriculture's role with regards to greenhouse gases. There's been a couple of reports. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the main scientific body that was put together through the United Nations and is working on climate change, they estimate that livestock globally account for approximately 10%. FAO did a similar study, and they suggest around 18% of the greenhouse gases, mainly methane, comes from livestock. And methane, you know, the major livestock species then is ruminants. When you think about swine, we are drops in the ocean compared to ruminants when it comes to methane emissions. So here's a couple of quotes from this FAO study that livestock has a large impact on climate change. There's a rising demand for animal products, and we need to find environmentally sustainable solutions. All of this revolving around the role of livestock, more specifically ruminants, with regards to greenhouse gases, and with regards to greenhouse gases, more specifically methane production. Let's look at some reduction opportunities for agriculture. Clearly, as I said, agricultural methane is our major greenhouse gas, and we have ways by which in livestock in general now, and swine specifically, that we can reduce that emission. There are a variety of improvements that we're making in our crops that we can decrease nitrous oxide emissions as well. And remember that that's 296 more times more potent than carbon dioxide. So we can reduce our emissions. Secondly, within agriculture, there are we can capture CO2 in soils, and so we can do that through reduced tillage methods, or converting, let's say, crops to grasslands, should we want to do that. Or secondly, there probably will be some cropland, some residual land, some perhaps marginal land that is converted into forestry, and that will capture carbon dioxide. So agriculture, or land, let's say in general, has a second role, an important role with regards to sequestration of carbon dioxide. And thirdly, with regards to an opportunity for ag, is to avoid or reduce our fossil fuel emissions. And we can do that in two ways. One, we can be a source of renewable fuel should we capture our methane from our manure. And secondly, transportation biofuels. You know that agriculture, whatever you think of the politics of it, whether it's good or bad, we are becoming a source of biofuels through agriculture, from agriculture. And secondly, with regards to avoiding fossil fuel emissions, we can be more efficient with regards to our energy consumption and reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. So those are all ways by which we can influence the emissions of greenhouse gases, and specifically methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture. I want to talk very briefly about measuring and managing our footprint, because as I said, there's increasing interest in this, and secondly, National Pork Board's got a very large project where they're focusing on this. Three things come to mind. One, efficiency. If there's a major argument that can be made in favor of efficiency, it's that we decrease our carbon footprint. So think about the different forces that we have in society today that are coming at us, for example, for cradle gestation, for confined housing, for using growth promotants. All of those we do to increase efficiency. We want to produce as much pork as efficiently as we can. And in so doing, what we do is we reduce our carbon footprint, which is a great thing when it comes to the environment. I'll show you a chart here coming up next, but it's really interesting, the changes we've made in terms of our carbon footprint from efficiency. Secondly, as I said, we can decrease our power consumption. We can be more efficient with regards to our consumption of power. And thirdly, when the economics are more attractive, and they're not very attractive yet, we can capture our methane emissions and become a source of renewable fuel. Now this chart here is really interesting. You'll see over in the bottom right, it was just published in the Journal of Animal Science, a highly credible journal. And you look at the two bars on the left, the carbon dioxide per cow in 1944 compared to 2007. And you see that the 2007 cow consumes approximately double the carbon dioxide than does the 1944 cow. However, you look at the right and you say, well, the product here is milk, and we are producing milk similar to us producing pork. And you see that the carbon dioxide per kilogram of milk in 1944 was over approximately three times what it was in 2007. So in other words, while we consume more carbon dioxide per cow today, we are so much more efficient. We're almost 3 times more efficient when it comes to our carbon footprint in milk than we were in 1944. And if you were to look at pork, a very similar argument will be made. That is, that the more efficient we are, everything we do about efficiency will decrease our carbon footprint. And the argument being, if we're going to eat meat, let's do it as efficiently as possible and minimize our carbon footprint. Some comments on digesters. You see here manure being captured from this dairy or hog facility in the lagoon, and in this particular lagoon it's covered, and what you have is the manure basically percolating or fermenting, producing carbon dioxide, methane. And then that methane, the biogas, goes off to the right there. You can see it going off to that facility, and that biogas is approximately 60% methane. the remainder being carbon dioxide and a little bit of carbon monoxide. But it goes into, in this little graphic, it goes into a generator, which generates electricity, and then you see CO2 coming off the top. And so basically the idea is you're taking methane, which has got, remember, 21 times the potency from a greenhouse gas point of view as does carbon dioxide. And so you're emitting carbon dioxide instead of methane, which is good. And then secondly, you can capture electricity, a renewable energy source, for the farm. And so this is great from several aspects in theory. Now, swine manure digesters, we did a study this past summer, as I said, in theory are a great idea. In practice, they're really under challenge, and we'll look at one as an example. Here are the costs that you would incur if you were to put up a swine manure digester. You've got the equipment and project costs, operating maintenance, and then if you have to use gas in order for a boiler or something, when the gas production from the digester is down, sometimes you need to use supplementary gas to keep it heated. So, and then revenues can be, if you are generating electricity, you might be selling that electricity, or you might offset the electricity that you would be using otherwise at home. You can capture revenue for carbon credits. There are tax credits. And then sometimes some folks will capture the heat from the generator, and you can offset heat use at the farm. We looked at, as an example, we looked at a digester that had roughly 2,800 sows, 8,000 nursery pigs, and 16,000 finishers feeding into the digester. This is called a fixed film digester, and interestingly, these folks have been trying extremely hard to get this to work, but they're currently 50% over budget, and the board managing the farm is extremely frustrated because they put more than they anticipated into this project, and it's still not working like they would like it to work. This is just a picture of the digester, and the issues that they're faced with basically revolve around insufficient gas production. This is occurring especially in the wintertime when the manure entering the digester is a lower temperature. The design on this particular digester was for 3 days retention at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which for most other digesters we would say is low, and maybe one of the reasons for insufficient gas production. And secondly, or the second possible reason for the insufficient gas production is maybe as a manure source today going into the digester, we're so efficient on feed efficiency that there's relatively little raw material to generate methane in that digester. So the too low of volatile solids is a possibility on the product going into the digester. Secondly, we don't really know the influence of antibiotics and heavy metals from nursery diets. Thirdly, what about the fact that we flush or wash down farrowing facilities once a week with disinfectant? Could that be influencing the bugs that generate the methane in the digester? So this is just an example of one farm that's trying hard to get this digester to work and struggling. This is a list of USDA digesters, swine digesters that we're aware of in the United States today. And we've reviewed several of these, and I think it's fair to say that the majority are struggling. And this is available online should you choose to look for them. But the majority of these are struggling, and I think if of those we've talked to, would not put up a digester again today, given the struggles they've had. Then there are several digesters that have been shut down or canceled. And again, I'm emphasizing these are swine digesters. And the issues being that I don't think we've got the swine digester technology figured out in light of today's economic conditions. A few comments on carbon credits. Carbon credits are a financial payment that somebody is going to make to you for your efforts in reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. So in other words, let's say today I was to put up a digester. Before I was emitting some methane into the environment. Today I put in a digester, and now I'm emitting less methane than I was. That reduction in methane emission can be quantified, or at least estimated, and calculated to be an equivalent of CO2, tons of CO2. Those annual reductions of tons of CO2 are called carbon credits. Each ton is one carbon credit. And those carbon credits can be sold. Now, one caveat of carbon credits is they have to be additional and permanent. In other words, in the marketplace, I have to be able to demonstrate that those carbon credits have not always been there, that I haven't had, for example, that I did, in fact, have these methane emissions before, and now I don't. And I wouldn't have done it without, perhaps, the augmentation to income by carbon credits. In other words, it's truly an additional feature that I've put into my farm. And secondly, it's permanent. It's not transient, the change that today I'm emitting less emissions and tomorrow I will be emitting them again. It's a permanent addition to my farm. Those carbon credits trade in the United States in the voluntary market. We, in other words, are not, we're not compelled to reduce our emissions beyond what the EPA requires. And so those carbon credits trade on the, you can trade them on the Chicago Climate Exchange, or you can trade them in private trades among individuals. It's a voluntary market. Here's where you see the price of carbon credits at the Chicago Climate Exchange over the last approximately 6 years. The green line is the price per ton, and you can see that most recently when I checked these prices, which was early September, they were at a record low, and that reflects that reflects basically supply and demand of carbon credits and people's estimation of what they're worth. And so that's a discouraging, if you're in the market of selling carbon credits, that's a discouraging price, of course. The data would suggest that given our increasing interest in greenhouse gases, and in our case methane, that these carbon credit prices are going to go up. Here's some estimations from March of 2008. Now, I want to emphasize 2008 when energy prices were extremely high. And these are some estimates. This is a survey of 2,591 individuals, of which you see up in the top left, 2,157 were in Europe and 967 in the U.S. And here you're seeing what these folks are estimating the price of carbon credits will be in 2020. So I just told you that they're currently trading at less than $1, and these folks were estimating them. You can see the bulk of them are saying, we think they're going to be in the $30 to $50 range per credit. Now that's, so 30 to 50 times what they are today. Now again, I want to emphasize that was a year ago when energy prices were at record high. Today, here's what carbon credits are estimated to be marketing, to be selling at here, and you can see the estimate for 2012 to 2015, an estimate by the EPA, and another estimate for 2020 by the EPA at $16. The Energy Information Administration is estimating them to be worth $20 to $32, and for this reason, because this is again 13 to 32 times what they're trading today, in the Senate they're discussing, as they discuss a climate change bill, having a price floor and a ceiling on these carbon credits. And there you get a price for what they anticipate these carbon credits to be trading for, $10 to $28. As you think about the price of a carbon credit then, let's say $10 a credit, and let's look at the second bullet being a swine digester. If you were to put up a swine digester, you can see that you would generate 2 to 3 tons of CO2 per pig space per year from that digester. So if you had, let's say, 10,000 pigs, and you were generating 2.5 tons of carbon credit per year, that'd be 10,000 times 2.5 times $10 would be your carbon credit income from that digester. And then you see down below the current over-the-counter credits that are given for reduced tillage, 0.2 to 0.6 tons of CO2 per year should you sign up for reduced tillage agreements. And that 0.2 to 0.6 depends on the region of the country. So where are we headed? Clearly, I think we would all agree, as energy becomes increasingly scarce, it's going to become more expensive. And so what that means for us is that the more efficient we are as consumers of energy, the lower will be our cost, and that's going to only increase in terms of pressure for us to become more efficient. And secondly, as energy becomes more expensive, we're going to have an increasing opportunity as being a generator of renewable energy. I said that these digesters don't look very attractive today for swine, but as energy costs go up, the return on investment will also go up, and we'll get these little technical issues figured out, I'm very confident. Secondly, there will be increasing pressure for us to reduce our footprint. That's going to come from our consumers, and we're going to be looking at production efficiency and intensity, and as I said, that's a great reason to continue to be as efficient as we can. We're going to be reducing the footprint not only of our pork, but in so doing, we're going to look at our inputs, and our biggest input is going to be corn, and we're going to say, how can we reduce the carbon footprint of our corn input, and thereby reduce the carbon footprint of our product, pork. So what we've done in this presentation is we briefly discussed climate change and what greenhouse gases are and what their relative potencies are. We talked very briefly about the role of ag and then opportunities for agriculture as we look ahead. Briefly, we discussed carbon credits and what those are, and finally, where I think we're headed. Appreciate your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you at the Layman Conference, should you come. Thank you.
Great, Bob. Nice job. Let me